It's very nice to see you today, and thank you for braving the weather, which is not going to light up or get any better for those who are coming tomorrow, unfortunately, either. For those of you from further afield, I did email you to warn you, but maybe to put you maybe in a more cheerful, celebratory mood. The setup here is a little bit like a wedding, I think. We're not really quite prepared for the tablecloth tables, but why not? It might help sort out your laptops and other gear. For those of you who were here with us at Glasgow University last time at the first workshop, it's very nice to see a lot of familiar faces. Today, as you know, the topic is crowdsourcing, co-curation, co-creation. So probably I think one of the first things that will come as an issue in the discussions is terminology and the use of those terms. Because there are projects also, there's the citizen science one, and we'll talk a little bit about the difference. What about this crowd as opposed to really responsible citizens who want to contribute and participate in this new culture and collaborate with scientists? And does this model with the citizen science really fit well the cultural heritage sector? So there's a lot of other questions as well. This is an area of very active development, and it was in your evaluation forms and the discussions we had in May, a lot of you mentioned that it would be really useful to have a little bit more on that. In our initial application to the Royal Society, we had put something about user needs and talking to the users. So we thought this area of crowdsourcing is one of the ways that users have a greater involvement. But it's also, because of all this great development, there are a lot of issues, not just about policy and about practice, because as with most things in cultural heritage or in life, in order for this to really work well, it needs to be a win-win situation. So the people participating, whether it's the crowd or the responsible citizens, they need to be getting something out of it. And I think that raises a lot of issues for the cultural heritage institutions of the different variety, size, and organizational structure. How do we really organize this, prepare it? Because there's also, it seems to be a lot of false assumptions around about this being a free activity. A lot of people are doing this for nothing. And there are also a lot of questions the last year about the quality of the metadata or the quality of the data generally that you're getting out of this. And there's different efforts, and we'll explore some of those in some of the projects that are going to be mentioned today, some of the quality control mechanisms. This is quite a large area that we can only dip into some of these questions today, but I think it's very useful to start this discussion. I know that some of you from the communications we had are thinking within your institutions of maybe exploring this a little bit further, because apart from the excitement, there's also a lot of hesitation about what kind of skills are required before I even embark on something like this, any kind of crowdsourcing or relevant activity. We've got, because there's a lot of developments around the world and in Europe, we have some speakers from overseas as well. Fred Truyen from the KU11 in Belgium, unfortunately because of the bomb attacks in Paris that had an effect also in Brussels and the whole of Belgium, it was impossible for him to come, so he managed to send a video message for later on. But Milena will pick up because she's here, and it's very nice to have her from the University of Malta. We'll say more about the activity of the network, which is EU funded. You'll see in your program we have a variety of sizes and institutions involved. And we wanted, like last time, this to not be a few parallel monologues, but to really have a discussion afterwards. So I'll ask the speakers to try to limit to about 20 minutes, so we have a few questions at the back of each session, but more importantly, in the afternoon we'll break into groups. We'll try during the lunch break to change the wedding setup to a little bit more group work friendly, and you'll have different moderators. Will be about 8 groups, so we can really go in greater depth, and you can bring your own experience, your own questions and issues to this. And then the groups will report back to the plenary at the end of the session. Just now that you're all here and not tired yet and listening, to flag for our next workshop, number 3. It's going to be hosted by the University of Strathclyde, and it's going to be at the end of March, the 31st of March. So already, if you want, put it in your diaries. Of course, we'll follow up with emails. And we're planning for the fourth one to be probably at the end of May or beginning of June. The next one is going to be about methodologies and the how. How do we evaluate the different kinds of digital resources, and what are some of the new ways, or maybe the older methods that have been used in new contexts in this area. So that's also quite an important area. While number 4, we'll be looking at the question of value and impact, and what do those terms mean when we're talking about digital cultural resources. Practicalities. The toilets are to your right further there, and there are more one floor down. We are tweeting on this, and if you manage, I hope you all got the Wi-Fi connection. It's a little bit patchy when you go further out. It's Digi, CH, and W for workshop, W2. So DGCHW2 if you want it for the hashtag for Twitter for today. And I think I'll pass on to Mia Rich now, who is digital curator at the British Library. I saw her book flying around. I'm not so sure who brought it. As you probably, if you don't know, Mia, so I don't think we're doing sales quite, but it's one of the standard references for crowdsourcing in the cultural heritage sector. It's an edited volume, which I think is an indication of how it's a lot of collaborative work, and it's important because it builds on Mia's research, working with a lot of different kinds of cultural institutions. Again, the sizes and the institutional context, the kind of collections and the kind of audiences that we're trying to reach, and the way they went about doing crowdsourcing. Which is why I asked her to try to distill this experience in about 20 minutes and give us a little bit of an introduction in this area. So without further ado, I'm going to pass on to her. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you to the organisers for bringing us all together here today. So my goal today is to give you a quick overview of what we are talking about when we say crowdsourcing in the cultural heritage sector. Because it has significant differences to other sectors in terms of how it works, what it means. I'll show you some key examples, some new approaches, and then discuss some of the challenges and issues that we face when crowdsourcing our cultural heritage. Okay, so it's obligatory to quote the original definition of crowdsourcing. Of course, it's a problematic term. It comes from outsourcing. And for cultural institutions, it has that scary word, crowd. We might like crowds coming through the doors to go to an exhibition, but we don't like crowds pouring through the collections, and that's sometimes how people felt crowdsourcing worked out. Of course, it's never really a crowd. They're not usually unknown. They're usually small numbers of people, but some of them are highly dedicated. But it's a bit too late to find an equivalent term that has the same resonance. But whenever you hear crowdsourcing, you have to sort of note in the back of your head that as a term, it's almost the opposite of what it stands for when it's in cultural heritage. So I find Clay Shirky's concept of the cognitive surplus a nicer way of thinking about it. It's the idea that we have a highly educated population, more people than ever going through tertiary education, let alone finishing high school. We don't work all the hours of the day. We sit on our sofas with amazing devices in our hands that hold more computing power than computers that went into space. So that time can be turned to doing things more constructive than just watching reality TV. And an even simpler way of looking at it is just thinking about it as volunteering online. Some of you may have experience with working with volunteers in cultural organisations. Some of you may have volunteered yourself or know family members or friends who volunteer. And it's often the same motivations, the same intrinsic interest in a collection that drives people to contribute to cultural heritage online. So I've coined my own definition for crowdsourcing in cultural heritage, which is that it's asking people to help with tasks that contribute to a shared significant goal. It's not just asking people to help you with your homework. A significant goal or research interest related to cultural heritage collections or knowledge. So the work that people do should in some way help make the world a better place. It might make your collections more discoverable. It might make them better known. one of the really important factors is that we don't pay volunteers, we don't pay contributors to online projects. So the activities and or the goals should be inherently rewarding. So people should be, the tasks should be enjoyable. They should feel like it's helping them further their own goals. It might be an interest in local history. It might be an interest in a particular kind of art or particular kinds of trains. Whatever it is, the task and the purpose should be very closely related to your mission, and everything that you do should help improve those. So really quickly about how I got into this. I worked for museums for a long time, and I got interested in the opportunity that existed between public engagement and the need to enhance collections. So I mostly worked in museums with social history collections, some natural history collections and art as well. And we know that, say, 8% of any given collection is on display. And often that might be the best described part of the collection as well, where you have thousands of rows that simply say pot or ant or stuffed bird, probably a bit more than that. But really simply described records. We don't have the resources to go back and improve the information we hold about all of our collections. It's difficult enough getting resources to digitize images or take photographs of 3D objects. But I also knew that lots of people, when you say you work in a museum or a library, lots of people say, I'd love to do that, but I have a sensible day job instead. So it's a way for people to follow their interest, to get a behind-the-scenes sense of what's going on. So I thought if we can combine these two, then we'll get somewhere. So I made crowdsourcing games an incredibly long time ago in internet years, 2010, where I was trying to engage people with the history of science by getting them to tag really obscure objects, either sort of early telescopes or modern scientific objects. And it turns out that people will be engaged. There's something about the act of closely looking at objects that gives them a new kind of relationship with the content. So I realised there's something there, and I've carried that through in later research, including writing the book, and thank you, Maria, for those very kind comments. So one of the things I like to do is point out that crowdsourcing is not new, and I particularly like to tell this to technologists who think they've invented crowdsourcing. There's a long history of public participation in scientific research, in collecting observations, and also the Oxford English Dictionary is one of the earliest crowdsourcing projects. So here we have James Murray, and the white things behind him are contributor slips. So they began with a small closed society of people asking them to find the earliest possible sources for words for the English dictionary. And then they came to realise that it's actually quite a large task. And they asked the public for help. So they asked twice. You can see in the gap, the 20 years between, you can see the size of the task that they'd set themselves. James Murray sent and received so many letters that he had a post box installed outside his house, which is still there in Oxford. He had to manage these pieces of paper. He had to try and discern, someone's authority or their intent when all you really had was the handwriting of the person on the slip and the reference to the book they'd given. Computers have made the process of reaching contributors much easier. The process of coordinating and validating contributions is it's infinitely faster than it was. We can apply all kinds of computational techniques to the process of validating contributions. But the same basic model of people being willing to give up their time to help with a project that's bigger than themselves still underlies a lot of what we see in crowdsourcing and cultural heritage. So a quick look at some examples. I've tried to include a range of tasks or output types, source materials, validation methods, organisational structures and goals. So you've probably all contributed in crowdsourcing, even if you didn't realise it, because have you ever had to fill in one of these to do a form online? Okay, so what you were doing was helping transcribe words from historic books that hadn't been recognised by the OCR software. These days what you're helping do is entering street numbers for Google Street View, but this is how it began. So there was a test word and a word from the book, and the test word was there to make sure that you weren't just putting in any old nonsense, and the word from the book would go back into the record for that book and it would be a slightly better record. If you did the audio version, then you were helping transcribe historic radio broadcasts. So this is the work of Louis Van Aan, a guy who always has a knack of doing more than one thing at the same time. So any action has a wider social benefit as well as a benefit for the individual. This is one of my favourite examples, partly because I use the record set myself. The Trove online newspaper section was one of the early digitisation projects that they realised the OCR error rates were going to be really high on newspapers of this age and this quality. So they set up a system where if you notice there's a badly recognised word, then you can change it. So there's a really simple line-by-line transcription form where you can just add in things really quickly. You don't need to sign up. It's a really quick transaction, and once you've done it, you can see that it's actually made a difference. So a word that was unrecognisable is now searchable. And I find it particularly satisfying for people's names, partly because I know that newspapers are used by so many family historians. It's a nice thought to think that you spend a few seconds and someone else might discover an ancestor. So the Your Paintings tagger I think we'll hear about a bit later as well. There are lots of tagging projects, and it's a nice way to get started on crowdsourcing. It makes the material more discoverable. It can be a really satisfying task for people to do. And there is something about that closely engaged act of looking. If you're going to tag an object, you need to look at it enough to describe it. And that helps create a new relationship with cultural heritage. And then we get things like structured transcription. Old Weather began as a project to digitise historic ship's logs in order to provide proxy data for understanding climate change. So ship's logs have very structured data. They said where they were, what the weather conditions were. It's written out in a sort of the consistent format per ship. And scientists could use that to think about how the climate was changing over time. Ship's logs also contain lots of interesting information. Not all the time, but when something happens at sea, it might be noted in the logs. So people started to get interested in what was happening outside the sort of weather information. And this really set the tone for a lot of citizen science projects and a lot of projects thinking about how can people become more deeply engaged in history, in understanding culture through exposure to these kinds of records. There's something about the cumulative exposure to these records that over time you get a sense of what's normal. You start to get a sort of really almost experiential sense of what daily life was like at sea as represented in those logs. Is an Irish project. They're collecting family letters written in 1916 as well as having them transcribed on the site. So this is sort of typing up letters, and of course reading someone else's letters, if you spend time in the archives, it's a fascinating way of sort of getting a glimpse of someone else's life. So people who might be doing this because they care about Irish history but didn't necessarily think that they had any role in interpreting history can start to get a sense of the daily lived experience of that time through these letters. And of course transcribing letters makes them searchable, makes them discoverable, makes them amenable to methods like text mining in ways that they're simply not when they are just handwritten texts. The British Library Georeferencer, there's a georeferencer at the National Library of Scotland as well. The British Library has a map collection that people who love maps know and love. So this is an opportunity for people to spend time with the British Library's maps. The point of this is that when a map is just a digital image, it's just an image. When you add coordinates to it, then it becomes a spatial document. A map is different to just an image of a map. So in this, you line up different points on the screen, and then, so you're pinning a historic map to a modern map, so you're giving coordinates to the map. And this kind of shows the power of finding the right audience. So people who love maps discovered this and kind of completed it really quickly the first round. Later rounds are more tricky, so if you're up for a challenge, give it a go. And again, this is an instance of people collecting things from the public. So in a way, it's an update of those 19th century weather observation projects. You could record the sounds in your environment. So you might record the sounds in your local coffee shop, playground, the intersection near your house. You could record any kind of sound that reflected your environment at the time. They also did a version with accents, looking at how accents changed as you moved around the country. This was an early version. They used technology, audio boo, that wasn't as widely available at the time. And they also had a large process of moderating the material, not because they were worried so much about people doing anything bad, but they had to be very careful about any recorded music that might have ended up in the recording. So if you record your favourite coffee shop and you don't realise there's a song playing in the background, Alanis Morissette might rock up to the British Library and say, well, actually, you're playing some of my music. So they had a moderation process. But for people who contributed, they felt like they'd really made a difference. They felt like they'd helped record their area, they'd been part of something really, a wonderful project that was bigger than themselves. So we're moving from simple sort of micro-task style things to more complex tasks. So we're moving from type what you see to go out and do something active. And here we're moving on to these history mysteries. It's a relatively new thing. It's based on a site called HistoryPin. They're trying to find specific kinds of information about the images. So it might be the dates and locations for photographs, identifying anyone in them, identifying what was going on. It's really tricky to get content like this in front of the right person, the person who knows enough about it to say something about it. Or you need to pique someone's curiosity. And I was teaching crowdsourcing and I showed this to one group, and one guy saw a park in San Francisco that he knows, and he spent the next hour, I knew he wasn't listening to me, he was going and investigating, finding modern street views of that park to match up, because that task had just struck him in such a way that he was really taken and he had to go and investigate it. And then we get things like these sort of avocational historians. Local historians in the UK sometimes undertake long-term, complex projects. This FreeBMD began in 1998. You can see that they are updating their site. They've got new versions for some of their sites, but this is pretty old school. This is the equivalent of sort of meeting in a village hall. It's passionate enthusiasts who are devoting their free time to this kind of work, and often significant amounts of free time. I think they have about 250 million records that have been added by volunteers. And it's one of those projects that sort of predates network technologies. A lot of these projects began by mailing or emailing Excel spreadsheets around to each other and then sort of manually combining them again. So I thought it's important to really quickly look at participatory project models. This comes from public participation in scientific research. A lot of the projects that we're talking about are contributory, so the public contributes data to something designed by the organisation. The organisation presents it as a fait accompli to the participants. This is what you're doing. Collaborative and co-creative projects have increasing levels of engagement and participation from participants, but of course that takes a lot more time for the organisation. So if you've worked on any community projects, or any cross-departmental projects, you know that anything that requires multiple decision makers takes a lot more time for conversation, for getting to understand each other's worlds, for understanding each other's goals, for coming up with mutually agreeable goals and methods, which is one reason why most of the projects that we see are contributory. So some quick thoughts on new approaches. We're seeing new tasks that wouldn't really have ever been done inside the institution. So a lot of the ones that we've seen before might have been done in the process of cataloguing material or as researchers worked on material. This is a project from the British Museum in UCL. What they're doing is they're drawing around images, and you can use those multiple images of the same object to turn it into a 3D model in software, and then from there you can turn it into printed 3D objects. So this kind of photo masking task to create 3D models never existed inside the institution previously. They're coming up with new ways of using people's enthusiasm and time. I've talked for a long time about simple tasks as stepping stones, and I think I first noticed this in family history sites. But now we're seeing it move through to more mainstream crowdsourcing and citizen science sites. So in this fossil finder, you're simply saying, is this image suitable for further processing? Because sometimes images collected by camera traps or by automatic methods, they're just too blurry or horrible, and you don't want to make someone else look at them. So here you're just sort of rating the image. But what that also does is give you a good sense of what is in a typical image. So it's that familiarity with the domain, again, that can be so important. And we see those kinds of tasks as being part of a task ecosystem. And I think the best group at the moment looking at task ecosystems is the New York Public Library. So this is a site called Building Inspector, where they've broken down the different parts of digitizing and creating information about these fire insurance maps into the smallest possible tasks. So each task takes like a second. You can do lots of them in a minute. Together they create a really complex data set about those documents. But no one has to do a complex task. It's really, they're more productive because they're tiny, tiny tasks. We're also seeing the growth of platforms, so it's easier than ever before to get your own project up and running. Each of these platforms has its history and its goals, and that will affect what you can do on those platforms. But if you just want to try something out, even from a year ago, it's so much easier than it was to quickly put some images up and work out the sort of simple workflow and get things going. So in the time I've got left, some challenges and issues. Mobile devices are fantastic, but they also have tiny keyboards and tiny screens. So if you're doing something that involves looking at an image and typing text, obviously that's quite difficult. So this is a family search app where they were experimenting with that time that people have waiting in queues, or any other time when you've got your mobile device out. But you can see, if you're used to transcribing handwriting, sometimes you need to know more about the particular hand of that person to get a sense of how they've transcribed things or how they've written things. So they've tried to build in a screen where you can sort of get a sense of the whole page as well. But it's a slightly awkward process. I think tablets, we know that tablet visits take up, people have sort of deeply involved visits on cultural heritage sites on tablets. So tablets might be the kind of the neat intersection where they have enough screen size to fit those things in, and people tend to sort of have them with them all the time. A lot of people don't realise that when you run a crowdsourcing project, what you're actually doing is inviting people into your institution and you're hosting them. That takes a lot of time, that takes energy. You can't just invite them, come and help us with this project, and then shut the door and lock yourself in the kitchen. You have to be in the room. So that is probably one of the main reasons, as the technology improves, one of the main reasons why crowdsourcing might not be viable for every project. If you don't have the time to answer questions, to encourage people, to thank them, to explain the difference that their contributions are making, then maybe think twice about whether you actually want to get involved in crowdsourcing. Some people are sort of serial participants. They'll look at your project with their knowledge of other projects. So someone like me might analyse lots of websites in terms of the characteristics, but they're doing it too. They're as expert as people creating the sites. So the crowd they're not just incredibly grateful that you're there. They'll look at what you're offering and they'll assess it against other projects. One of the final things is people sometimes go off-piste. This is a quote from, it was a reading project where people were reading newspapers and sending in information. And one of the guys was posting in the forum saying, I've done this, I've done this, I've done this, I've done this, but none of this is ready to send to you because I'm still going to do more to it. And the people who read the project were like, that's fabulous, but could you just send us what you've got in the meantime? So sometimes people get distracted by the task. We're asking people to work with historical materials that are each in their own way fascinating. So it's not surprising, but it does mean that each of these things is a balancing act. You need to decide how important productivity is for you versus how important public engagement or that deeper learning or that moment that people have when they're encountering their culture or their heritage online. And finally, hopefully this would happen to any crowdsourcing project, you run out of material. But again, like hosting a party, you need to think about what happens to the participants afterwards. Do you just sort of dump them and run, or do you find other things for them to go on to? Do you partner with other organisations to say, we've run out of maps or we've run out of postcards, but over here there's a new postcard project so you can go and work with them. So just think about what happens to your community when you come to the end of a project. And speaking of graceful exit, I'd like to say thank you.
We have the mobile. Thank you so much for a very interesting presentation that I think set out a lot of the issues that are going to run through the other talks as well. I think this analogy about not locking yourself in the kitchen is particularly relevant to a lot of us here today. Were there any questions or comments at this stage for Mia? Yep. At the back we can have, I think, the microphone as well. Do you want to try shouting? Do you want to
Thanks for a fascinating talk. One thing I'm interested in is how closely do you think the crowdsourcing effort has to relate to that like content? It's what I'm thinking of. I'm involved in things like OCR correction. And there are people who make games to do that. And the games are sort of based on American football. And they seem to have no direct connection to underlying material, which is called taxonomic monographs. So can you sort of completely separate the game from the activity, or should the game reflect the underlying content in some way?
Yeah, are you thinking of the tilt factor metadata games? Oh, the OCR, where you...
The one I have in mind is from a project called Biodiversity Heritage Library,
okay,
where they've got OCR texts trying to correct them and have made these very stylized games, and you have no idea of the underlying text in the sense you're playing this game. Does it matter where you have that connection with the actual underlying?
Yeah, I think in those cases where a game is sort of very much designed as a game, it draws on tropes from game design, it draws on tropes from culture. They're not aimed necessarily, they're aimed at gamers. So in a way what they're trying to do is say, don't even worry about whether the content's interesting, we're making the process interesting. I think you get really strong resonances and a nice kind of virtuous circle when the interface relates to the mission of the organisation and to why the material is collected or why it's important now. But that's for a different audience. That's for an audience who already feels some level of agency around cultural heritage. And one of the key things I found in my research was that validating procrastination is really important. So people want an excuse to sit down with a cup of tea sometimes and just play a game. And if you say this game is helping a museum, it's helping biodiversity, that sometimes they don't worry about the details. They're just like, it's great that it's helping. It's kind of the equivalent of giving money to a charity. You don't necessarily worry where it goes. You're just like, I've done my bit. So those games, if they're really well-designed games, have a role for some people who wouldn't normally think of themselves as people who'd volunteer for a cultural organisation. Good question.
Thank you. Just following up on that, I wonder if the crowd doesn't quite understand what they're actually creating through mapping, do we then assume that they don't mind, do we assume that they don't have any intellectual right in the content they create? We are currently from the National Library of Scotland, we're currently looking into transcriptions of manuscripts, so there is the big question, who wants the transcription? And it's easier than to talk about that question when people are aware of what they're actually creating. Is that question very differently when they're not aware of what they're creating, or do we just assume they don't own it?
Sorry, can you say that last bit again?
Or do they just not own any right? Is there a joint, I know there isn't a joint kind of legal rule that tells me yes or no, that you do not own any rights in the content they create.
One of the really important things when you're setting up a project is to have a clear rights statement. If you work for a legally conservative institution, say one that doesn't ever want to make a wrong step and lose funding, then people internally might be really conservative if the content wasn't created under a clear license. So often when you sign up to play these games, or when you go to the site, there's a thing that says, by participating, I agree that my content is made available. And it's a simple thing, but it's really important to get that right at the start. I think one of the ethical responsibilities we have, as well as making the terms of use clear, is to show people how their contributions have made a difference. So, I don't know, I haven't actually played the football gain to see how it works, but whether that gives you a sense of this is the difference that it's made. But that's one reason why crowdsourcing can take some time, because actually going and finding evidence, for anyone who's had to do the RAF, that sense of like, this is the evidence of the impact of my thing. You can't just say, I went and gave a talk. You have to have a letter from someone saying, and it changed my life. So understanding things and taking care for participants is really important. And things like legal terms and conditions is just one of the basic hygiene aspects of a project.
We have time for one more last question, maybe. Well, there are more to come up later on probably, so I'll move on to our next speaker.